You open your eyes, and the first thing you feel is not relief at having awakened, but a kind of invisible weight descending upon your chest. It's as if the simple fact of existing were already a Herculean task you never asked to perform. You look around the room and everything seems normal, but there's something wrong with the way light enters through the window, something disturbing about how familiar objects seem strange, as if they belong to a life that isn't yours. You want to get up, but your body seems anchored to the bed by an emotional gravity that no one else can see. Your friends and family talk about plans, dreams, goals, and you just nod, pretending to understand this language of those who seem to have found an instruction manual for living that you never received. When they ask if you're okay, you say yes, because explaining that the simple act of existing has become an exhausting journey seems impossible to translate into words. You're not depressed in the clinical sense everyone knows. You're simply tired of carrying the weight of being yourself in a world that seems to have been designed for other people. Franz Kafka intimately knew this sensation of existential weight. He once wrote that life is a necessary evil, a phrase that may seem pessimistic, but which actually reveals a deep understanding about the complex nature of human existence. Kafka wasn't being dramatic or melancholic. He was simply naming an experience that millions of people live in silence. The feeling that existing is, in itself, arduous work. For him, recognizing this weight wasn't a weakness, but rather the first step toward a more honest understanding of what it means to be alive. When we look at Kafka's works, we find characters who fight not against dragons or epic villains, but against the very reality of having to continue existing in a world that makes no sense. It's as if Kafka had created a literary mirror where we can finally see our own existential exhaustion reflected. Marina, a 28-year-old woman, shared that she woke up every morning with the feeling that she needed to convince herself to get out of bed. It wasn't laziness, it wasn't diagnosed depression. It was something more subtle and deeper. It was as if each day demanded from her a performance of normalcy that left her emotionally drained before even having coffee. She functioned perfectly at work, maintained healthy relationships, paid her bills on time, but inside she carried this constant question: what am I doing all this for? When Marina discovered Kafka's texts, she encountered characters like Gregor Samsa, who literally transforms into an insect, but who metaphorically represents this sensation of waking up one day and no longer recognizing one's own existence. Marina realized that her experience wasn't a personal anomaly, but a human condition that Kafka had explored with brutal honesty. The weight of existing that you feel is not a character flaw or a sign that there's something fundamentally wrong with you. It is, in fact, a natural response to a world that often seems disconnected from our deepest values. We live in a society that prioritizes productivity over contemplation, speed over depth, appearances over authenticity. When you feel that simply existing is exhausting, you're reacting intuitively to an environment that wasn't designed to nourish the human soul. Kafka understood this when he wrote about characters trapped in incomprehensible bureaucratic labyrinths or unreachable castles. These weren't just literary metaphors, they were precise representations of what it feels like to navigate a world that seems to have rules that no one adequately explained. There's a fundamental difference between being depressed and being existentially tired. Depression is a serious medical condition that affects neurotransmitters and requires professional treatment. Existential fatigue, however, is a philosophical and emotional response to the perception that life, as it's structured, doesn't offer the deep meaning our soul yearns for. When you feel heavy upon waking, it may be that your internal system is signaling that you need more than just functioning. You need authentic purpose. Kafka captured this distinction when he created characters who weren't psychologically ill, but rather alienated from an existence that seemed absurd and directionless. The protagonist of the trial isn't mentally unstable. He's trying to understand a system that operates by incomprehensible logics, just as many of us try to understand why certain social expectations exist. Modern society has created what we might call a bureaucracy of the soul, a complex system of expectations, unwritten rules, and social performances that consume our vital energy. You wake up and need to play the role of someone productive, optimistic, sociable, and ambitious, even when inside you just want permission to exist without having to constantly prove your worth. Kafka portrayed this masterfully in The Castle, where the protagonist K desperately tries to access an authority he can never reach, facing a labyrinthine bureaucracy that seems to exist only to perpetuate its own existence. How many times have you felt like K, trying to navigate social, professional, or even personal systems that seem to have their own absurd rules? How many times have you wondered why you need to jump through so many hoops just to have the basic right to exist in peace? Carlos, a 35-year-old man, worked at a multinational company and had what anyone would describe as a successful life. His own house, new car, stable relationship, healthy bank account. But every morning, when the alarm went off, he felt like an actor who had forgotten his lines. He would get up, shower, dress, drive to the office, attend meetings, answer emails, and inside wonder, what's the real meaning of all this? It wasn't ingratitude or lack of ambition. It was an acute perception that his life had become a series of mechanical movements disconnected from any purpose that truly mattered to him. When Carlos read The Metamorphosis, he deeply identified with Gregor Samsa, not because he wanted to transform into an insect, but because he understood the feeling of waking up one day and realizing that his life had become unrecognizable to himself. What Kafka teaches us is that recognizing this existential weight is not the end of the journey. It's the beginning of a deeper transformation. When you admit that existing has become too heavy, you're allowing yourself to question structures that perhaps never made real sense to you. You're giving yourself permission to stop pretending everything is fine when there's clearly something in your soul crying out for more authenticity, more meaning, more real connection with who you are beyond external expectations. Kafka didn't write his works to leave us desperate. He wrote them to show us that we're not alone in this feeling of alienation, and that recognizing our condition is the first step to transcending it. The journey out of this existential weight begins with the radical acceptance that you don't need to carry the world on your shoulders. You don't need to be productive every day. You don't need to always be optimistic. You don't need to have all the answers about your future. Kafka shows us that authentic freedom begins when we stop trying to decipher absurd systems and start creating our own meanings. This doesn't mean abandoning responsibilities or living irresponsibly. It means finding ways to exist that honor your deeper nature instead of sacrificing it on the altar of social approval. One of the most liberating discoveries in Kafka's work is that the absurd of existence doesn't need to be resolved. It can be embraced. When you accept that not everything in life will make perfect sense, when you stop demanding that each day have an epic purpose, you open space to find beauty and meaning in small and imperfect moments. Kafka found depth in the most mundane situations, transforming daily anxiety into transcendent art. You can do something similar with your own experience. Instead of fighting against the weight of existing, you can begin to investigate what this weight is trying to teach you about your deepest values. Perhaps the weight you feel upon waking is your internal system protesting against a life that doesn't reflect who you really are. Perhaps it's a sign that you need more silence, more nature, more creativity, more authentic connections, more time to simply be without having to do. Kafka spent hours walking alone through the streets of Prague, observing, thinking, allowing his mind to wander without a specific agenda. This wasn't procrastination or escapism. It was a way of honoring his need for contemplation and introspection. When was the last time you gave yourself permission to exist without having a mental to-do list running in the background? Aina, a 42-year-old teacher, discovered that her existential weight decreased drastically when she created small rituals of connection with herself. She began waking up 20 minutes earlier, not to be more productive, but to have coffee in silence, watching through the window, allowing her mind to process the previous night's dreams. She stopped checking her phone immediately upon waking and created a small bridge between the dream state and daily reality. This simple change transformed the quality of her days because she began to honor her need for gentle transition instead of throwing herself brutally into the daily performance of normalcy. You know that moment, usually at dawn, when your mind fires a burst of questions that have no answers. Why am I here? What am I doing with my life? Why does everything feel so heavy? And then you lie there, heart racing, feeling as if you're floating in space without emotional gravity. If you've been through this, if your mind has ever held you hostage with these painful questions, write in the comments, "My mind won't stop." Just that. Because there's a strange magic in knowing that other people also carry this same internal whirlwind. Your honesty might be exactly what someone needs to not feel crazy for overthinking. The Kafkian path to dealing with existential weight doesn't involve easy answers or empty motivational formulas. It involves a kind of contemplative courage, the willingness to sit with your deepest questions without needing to resolve them immediately. Kafka frequently wrote about the importance of patience with mystery, about learning to inhabit questions instead of desperately seeking answers. When you feel that existing is too heavy, perhaps it's because you're trying to carry the weight of your entire life at once instead of simply carrying the weight of this specific moment. The practice of radical presence can completely transform your relationship with existential weight. Instead of waking up already thinking about all the days, weeks, months, years challenges, you can experiment with waking up and simply noticing how your feet feel on the floor, how air enters and leaves your lungs, how the light is different today. Kafka had an acute sensitivity to small and apparently insignificant details of daily experience. He found the infinite in finite moments, eternity in passing gestures. This isn't a self-help technique. It's a way of existing that recognizes that life happens in specific instants, not in future abstractions. There's also an important social dimension to existential weight that many ignore. We live in a culture that idolizes individuality, but at the same time demands conformity. Kafka constantly explored this tension between the human need to belong and the equally deep need to be authentic. When you feel that existing is heavy, it may be because you're living in emotional isolation, trying to carry alone questions that are universally human. Kafka's work, ironically, offers a form of connection with others who also feel the fundamental strangeness of being alive. Reading Kafka is discovering that you're not alone in your alienation, that there's an entire tradition of people who found beauty and meaning precisely in honesty about the difficulty of existing. The Kafkian transformation is not about becoming a different person. It's about becoming more fully who you already are, beneath all the layers of expectations and social performances. It's about finding ways to exist that honor your internal complexity instead of trying to simplify it to fit external models. Kafka never completely resolved his own existential questions, but he transformed his struggle into art, into insight, into a form of testimony that still today offers comfort and understanding for those who feel lost in the experience of being alive. When you feel like staying in bed because existing already weighs too much, remember that this might be your soul asking for a pause, not from life, but from the way you've been living. Perhaps you need fewer obligations and more contemplation. Perhaps you need less external noise and more internal silence. Perhaps you need fewer ready-made answers and more permission to inhabit your own questions. Kafka teaches us that authentic freedom doesn't come from solving all the mysteries of existence, but from finding ways to dance gracefully with them. The most liberating Kafkian truth is that you don't need to justify your existence through external achievements. You don't need to prove your worth through constant productivity. You don't need to carry the weight of being perfect, of having everything figured out, of always growing and evolving. Sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply exist without agenda, without hurry, without the need to transform every moment into a life lesson. Kafka found depth in quietude, meaning in simplicity, transcendence in radical acceptance of what is. The silent revolution that Kafka proposes is to live from the inside out, not from the outside in. This means stopping asking, "What does the world expect from me?" and starting to ask, "What does my soul need to flourish?" It may seem like a philosophical luxury amid life's practical demands, but it's actually an urgent necessity. When you live constantly trying to meet external expectations, you become a stranger in your own existence. Kafka portrayed this brilliantly in his diaries, where he wrote about the feeling of always playing a role, even when alone. Liberation begins when you recognize that the most important person to impress is yourself, not in a narcissistic sense, but in the sense of honoring your inner truth. There's a simple but powerful Kafkian exercise that can help when the weight of existence becomes unbearable. When you wake up feeling like you don't have the strength to face another day, try this. Instead of getting up immediately and throwing yourself into routine, stay in bed for 5 extra minutes and ask a single question. What is my body trying to tell me? Don't seek intellectual answers, just observe the physical and emotional sensations that arise. Perhaps your body is saying it needs more rest, more movement, more silence, more connection. Perhaps it's protesting against schedules that don't respect your natural rhythms or environments that drain your vital energy. Kafka had a deeply conscious relationship with his body, recognizing that physical exhaustion often reflected a deeper spiritual conflict. Modern culture treats fatigue as a problem to be quickly solved, preferably with caffeine, forced productivity, or digital distractions. But Kafka invites us to see fatigue as a messenger, not as an enemy. When you feel exhausted by simply existing, your system may be signaling that you're living in a way that's not sustainable for your soul. This doesn't mean you're weak or inadequate. It means you're sensitive enough to perceive when something is out of tune. In a society that often prizes insensitivity as strength, this sensitivity is actually a disguised superpower. Rodrigo, a 24-year-old recent engineering graduate, discovered that his existential weight was directly related to pressure to build a career that didn't reflect his deepest values. He had chosen engineering because it was practical and promised financial stability, but inside he felt like an imposter playing a character he didn't choose. Every morning upon waking, he felt as if he had to convince himself he was on the right path, even when all internal signals pointed in the opposite direction. When Rodrigo read The Trial, he deeply identified with Joseph K., who spends the entire book trying to understand accusations that are never clearly explained. Rodrigo realized he was living his own version of the trial, trying to justify himself before an internal tribunal that constantly judged him for not fitting expectations he hadn't even chosen. What Kafka teaches us through his works is that the feeling of being constantly judged, even when no one is watching, is a deeply human experience. We often carry an internal tribunal composed of voices we don't even recognize. Parental expectations, social pressures, comparisons with other people, unrealistic ideals about how we should be living. This internal tribunal operates 24 hours a day, issuing verdicts about our performance, our productivity, our capacity to meet external standards. When you feel that existing is too heavy, it may be because you're carrying the weight of these constant judgments. Kafkian freedom begins with the radical decision to dismiss this internal tribunal. This doesn't mean living without values or responsibilities. It means consciously choosing which voices deserve your attention and which you can gently dismiss. Kafka once wrote that solitude is very important in my life. It's a very important asset for me. He understood that we need space and silence to discern between our own voice and the chorus of external expectations that constantly tries to direct us. There's a spiritual dimension to existential weight that Kafka explored subtly but constantly in his texts. He understood that human beings aren't machines designed only to produce and consume. We're creatures who long for meaning, for beauty, for connection with something greater than ourselves. When our life becomes a series of tasks disconnected from any deeper purpose, our soul literally rebels. The weight you feel may be your spiritual essence protesting against an existence that doesn't honor your sacred nature. This doesn't mean you need to become religious in the traditional sense, but it means recognizing that there's a transcendent dimension in your experience that needs to be nurtured. For some people, this might mean more time in nature. For others, it might mean art, music, poetry, meditation, or simply moments of contemplative silence. Kafka found this spiritual dimension in writing, transforming his existential anguish into artistic creation. You can find your own form of alchemy, transforming the weight of existence into something beautiful and meaningful. Luciana, a 38-year-old woman who worked in the financial sector, discovered that her existential weight decreased drastically when she dedicated time to activities that had no productive purpose. She began drawing mandalas, not to become an artist or sell her creations, but simply because the act of creating colorful patterns calmed something deep in her soul. She realized she had spent years living only in function of measurable results, completely forgetting the importance of processes without specific objectives. When Luciana read Kafka, she understood that he too found refuge in apparently unproductive activities like long walks or silent contemplation. Capitalist society has trained many of us to see unproductive time as wasted time, but Kafka reminds us that some of life's most important moments happen precisely when we're not trying to achieve anything specific. It's in the empty spaces, in pauses, in moments of apparent inactivity that our soul can finally breathe and reorganize. When you feel that existing is too heavy, perhaps it's because you've eliminated all these sacred spaces from your routine, transforming your life into a constant race toward goals that aren't always yours. The question of identity is central to Kafka's work and crucial to understanding the existential weight many of us experience. How many times do you look in the mirror and ask yourself, who is this person? Not because you have amnesia, but because the person you became to survive in the world seems to have little relation to who you feel you really are inside. Kafka constantly explored this fragmentation of identity, creating characters who felt strange in their own lives. Gregor Samsa waking up transformed into an insect is just the most literal version of something many of us experience metaphorically. The feeling that our external identity doesn't correspond to our internal reality. The path back to yourself is neither linear nor quick, but begins with small acts of internal honesty. When someone asks how you are, experiment with giving an answer that reflects your inner truth instead of the socially expected response. When you feel like doing something that brings joy but seems useless, allow yourself to do it without justification. When a part of you cries out for solitude, honor that need instead of forcing sociability. These may seem like small changes, but they're actually revolutionary acts of self-compassion. Kafka understood that authentic transformation rarely happens through grand dramatic gestures. Most of the time, it emerges from thousands of small daily choices to honor our inner truth instead of betraying it in the name of convenience or external approval. Every time you choose to pause instead of accelerate when your soul asks for rest, Every time you choose silence instead of noise when you need contemplation, every time you choose authenticity instead of performance when your essence asks for genuine expression, you're participating in the silent revolution that Kafka defended. There's a question I know you've asked yourself, probably looking out a window or in the middle of some task. Does my life have any real meaning? And right after comes that heavy feeling that maybe you're just taking up space, living on autopilot, while everyone else seems to have discovered some secret you missed. If you've ever felt like this, as if you were searching for a door in an endless corridor, leave in the comments. Still searching. These simple words create an invisible network of people who, like you, have the courage to admit that the search for meaning is real and necessary. Kafka's work offers us a radical perspective on existential suffering. Instead of something to be avoided or quickly resolved, it can be seen as a portal to a deeper understanding of the nature of human existence. This doesn't mean romanticizing pain or seeking unnecessary suffering, but it means recognizing that some of the soul's deepest concerns cannot be resolved with superficial solutions. When you feel that existing is too heavy, you're having an authentically human experience that connects you with a lineage of thinkers, artists, and seekers who found beauty and wisdom precisely at the heart of their most difficult questions. The final Kafkian invitation is to embrace the complexity of being human instead of trying to simplify it. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to always be optimistic. You don't need to transform your journey into a motivational story with a guaranteed happy ending. You can simply be a real person, navigating the strange experience of being alive, with all the confusion, beauty, pain, and mystery that involves. Kafka reminds us that there's a deep dignity in fully inhabiting our humanity, even when, especially when, it doesn't fit into simple narratives or quick solutions. The true mastery in the art of living, according to the Kafkian perspective, is not in dominating existence, but in learning to dance with it even when we don't know all the steps. There's a strange beauty in recognizing that we're all beginners in the school of life, trying to decipher rules that constantly change. When you embrace this perspective, the weight of having to be perfect, of having to understand everything, of having to always be in control, finally dissipates. You can be vulnerable, you cannot know, you can be lost. And this doesn't diminish your value as a human being in any way. Kafka teaches us that authentic freedom doesn't come from finding all the answers, but from making peace with the questions. When you stop fighting against the mystery of existence and learn to inhabit it with curiosity instead of anxiety, your relationship with living itself is completely transformed. You go from someone who tries to control every aspect of experience to someone who allows themselves to be surprised, touched, transformed by the simple fact of being here now, breathing, feeling, being. And perhaps this is the greatest Kafkian revelation of all, that the weight of existing diminishes when we stop resisting what we are and begin to honor the courage that is simply being alive, with all its imperfections and uncertainties. If you've made it this far, it's because you recognize in yourself something of this existential weight that Kafka explored with such honesty. You're not alone in this journey of questioning, of feeling, of seeking something more authentic amid daily absurdity. This channel exists for those who understand that life's most important questions don't have easy answers, but deserve to be explored with courage and compassion. Every week, we create a safe space where you can pause, breathe, and rediscover gentler ways of existing. Subscribe not just to receive notifications, but to be part of a community that believes your existential fatigue is valid and that your search for meaning deserves to be honored. Together, we'll transform the weight of existing into a journey of profound self-knowledge, because you deserve to find ways of being alive that nourish your soul, not just your resume.